Like some beast, it destroyed not just a few people, but rampaged across whole cities and destroyed them. At the dawning of the Antonine Plague, the Roman Empire was at the pinnacle of its power. Then along came the disease, dealing out a host of horrifying symptoms. Fever, diarrhea, a black pox, and for those badly afflicted, there was the coughing up of scabs that had formed inside their bodies. But what was this illness so destructive that not even the mighty Roman army could stop it? And how did its occurrence signal the downfall of an empire? Welcome to the Roman Empire. Doctor. The Greek physician Galen lived in Rome in 166 AD when the plague began to break out there. He was physician to Emperor Marcus Aurelius and wrote a lot about the nature of the disease, so much so that it has been called the Plague of Galen. One of the first indications of the sickness, Galen noted, was that although the sufferer was, quote, raging with fever inside, those afflicted with the plague appeared neither warm nor burning to those who touched them. Suddenly, they would break out in small red spots that covered the body. After a couple of days, this turned into a rash, and the fever blisters that appeared over the following 2 weeks scabbed over before they broke off. Not everyone died from the plague. Quote, on those who would survive who had diarrhea, a black exanthem, which was the widespread rash, appeared on the whole body. Due to a remnant of blood which had putrefied the fever blisters like some ash that nature had deposited on the body. Of some of those who remained ulcerated, the part of the surface called the scab fell away, and then the remaining part nearby was healthy, and after 1 or 2 days became scarred over. In those places where it was not ulcerated, the exanthema was rough and scabby and fell away like some husk, and hence all became healthy. Perhaps worse was how Galen described how the, quote, black excrement was a symptom of those who had the disease, whether they survived or perished of it. If the stool was not black, the exanthem always appeared. All those who excreted black stool died from it. So for those whose feces turned black, the chances of survival were pretty low, and it was the end of the line. 2 weeks in, the rash would start to cover the throat and the tongue. Many sufferers began to cough up blood, and their voices became hoarse because the disease infected their larynx. The dark skin rash, referred to as exanthem, which peeled off the surviving patient, is the main reason that researchers have identified the disease as smallpox, although some have argued that it could have been either typhus or measles. However, before 1600, people could not tell the difference between one disease or another, and any quick-spreading infection was referred to as plague, so the name didn't make any difference to the Romans. To them, it was just a horrific sickness with no cure and only a small chance of survival. Blame the Defilers. There has always been debate over the total death toll from the Antonine Plague. The British writer and historian Frank McLynn placed the mortality rate as somewhere between 10 and 18 million people. In 189 AD, when the outbreak was at its height, the Roman historian Cassius Dio claimed the plague caused the deaths of about 2,000 people a day in the capital alone. It was later said to have begun because some Roman soldiers desecrated the shrine of Apollo when they sacked the city of Seleucia in Persia. It's true that the army was struck down by an infection while they were in Iran, and Apollo did have a reputation for vengeance, spreading plagues as a form of revenge in the opening of Homer's epic poem The Iliad. No, blame the Christians. At the time that the Antonine Plague hit, the Roman emperor was the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius. Guided by his beliefs, his attitude was to exercise restraint and employ reason at all times, but especially during periods of crisis. However, as soon as the plague broke out, his citizens quickly ditched the keep calm and carry on idea, and went instead with the only other option of turning to magic and murdering Christians. The Greek mystic and oracle Alexander Aponticus made an absolute fortune by selling worthless charms, telling the people to hang them in their doorways for protection. But then swindlers have always been around to prey on the hopes and fears of the vulnerable. Described by the contemporary writer Lucian as, quote, a complete fraud, the cult leader Aponticus has since been given the label of a malignant narcissist. As for the Christians, they were the usual suspects when it came to Roman scapegoats. They were already persecuted by the state, they were treated just like any other criminal deemed to be dangerous and thought to be deserving of death. Social disease. Just before the plague struck, Rome was inhabited by around 1 million souls, making it the most populated city in the history of Europe until the Industrial Revolution. In the wider empire, during the 200-year-long period of Pax Romana, when there was peace, order, and stability across the region, there were between 55 and 70 million people. That's 1 in 4 humans living in Roman-ruled territory. In the capital, the apartment buildings teemed with immigrants and day workers. The migrants who flocked to the empire's cities were the most vulnerable, living in the worst areas with filthy and unsanitary conditions. Their unsophisticated immune systems were not prepared for the onslaught of the bacteria that was endemic there. Amid a pandemic on the scale of the Antonine plague, such people were defenseless. The elites were not immune to the ravages of the plague either. It cut down the aristocracy to such an extent that town councils were unable to meet, and there was a shortage of local magistrates. In the countryside, there were abandoned villages and farms from northern Europe to Egypt. Emperor Aurelius, ever the pragmatist, was busying himself by making new laws, such as making it illegal to turn your villa into a giant tomb and forbidding anyone from digging a body up and using the grave for your own dead. Anyone who had a court summons but needed to go to a funeral was excused, and those who could not afford their own funeral were given a free one paid for by the state. This wasn't because Aurelius was a benevolent and empathetic leader, but rather because he didn't want the corpses to start piling up in the streets. After all, 2,000 deaths a day was a lot of dead bodies. To make matters worse, the undertakers, always the first to profit from other people's misery, started to charge obscene prices for their services. Rome's inhabitants produced around 45,000 kilograms of fecal waste and 1.3 million liters of urine every day. Despite having sanitation, the sewers were never meant for waste disposal, but rather to prevent flooding. They were, in fact, a haven for rodents and the perfect place to dump bodies. On a normal plague-free day, the body count in 2nd century Rome was likely to be in the hundreds, more in the summer months. It wasn't just the capital either. Cities all across the empire were impossible to keep clean. In Pompeii, people defecated anywhere they wanted, and piles of both human and animal sewage were commonplace on the streets. In the many public baths, the stagnant water wasn't chemically treated and was steeped in the oil, grease, muck, and bacteria from the hundreds of sweaty bodies that bathed in them daily. Prostitutes conducted their businesses beside the fetid waters, and who knows how many sexually transmitted diseases they carried. The military commander Pliny the Elder noted that the, quote, damp warmth of the bathhouses was the perfect breeding ground for cockroaches. Today we know that they probably share their home with a huge variety of other parasites and viruses. Physicians like Galen sent many patients to the public baths for treatment, some of them with open sores. Instead of alleviating the spread of infection, Roman sanitation encouraged its progression. Let's face it, Rome was a shithole, poverty was rampant, and disease was rife. Are you not entertained? Those soldiers who had been on leave when the plague struck now carried the infection back to the camps, and the plague was spread to other legions. There was a shortage of able-bodied men just when the Germanic tribes were becoming a problem. Marcus Aurelius went on a recruitment drive. Gladiators seemed like the obvious choice as they already knew how to fight. The problem was, the people of Rome were not happy. They loved their gladiatorial contests, and things were already bad enough what with people dying all over the place. Now their beloved sporting stars were going off to fight some tribesmen in a distant land. Only a few gladiators stayed behind, meaning fewer matches and a hike in the entrance fee at the arena. This did not go down well with the people. Entertainment was necessary for them to have some sort of outlet, an escape from the horror that was happening all around them. Ironically, they did that by going to watch more horror, but let's not be judgy about that. Marcus Aurelius, along with many of his predecessors, was particularly mindful of the threat of mass violence. After all, according to the 4th century soldier Ammianus Marcellinus, rioting was, quote, a thing which constantly happened in Rome. Aurelius decided that the best way to suppress the unrest was to make condemned criminals fight in the arena. Hundreds of lions were also enlisted into the games and shot at by archers, and Christians were dragged in as a form of entertainment. After all, killing lions is all well and good, but throwing Christians to them first was even better. Needs must. With his army depleted, the emperor who was up against it had to take drastic measures and began to recruit bandits, freed slaves, and even Teutonic men from rival tribes, offering them money to join his troops. Roman soldiers were disciplined, which was hardly a character trait that outlaws were known for, and many of the freed slaves were well past their prime. Most had only been freed because they were too old to be useful anymore. The once formidable Roman army was now a ragtag band of misfits. With military expenses increasing and a population paralyzed by disease, economic problems appeared on the horizon. Marcus Aurelius took the drastic step of auctioning off his imperial assets from the monumental complex of Trajan's Forum, selling off, according to the historian Eutropius, quote, gold crystal and murrhine drinking vessels, even royal vases, and his wife's silk and gold embroidered clothing, and certain jewels. The sale went on for 2 months, and such a quantity of gold was acquired. As a temporary measure, the auction worked, and the money raised helped to finance the rest of the Marcomannic War. In 172 AD, the tribe was defeated, and the 160,000 Romans they had captured were released. Then, according to Marcus Aurelius' intentions, he gave permission to buyers to return their purchases and get their money back if they wanted. He didn't cause trouble to anyone, whether they returned what they had bought or not. Before the plague came along, the Roman Empire had never experienced a pandemic. Not one that spread so quickly and was so widespread. Yes, there were localized breakouts of disease, but nothing on the scale of the Antonine plague. A sickness that wiped out around 50% of the Roman Empire. The aftermath of the Germanic tribes crossing the Danube and capturing so many Romans highlighted the fact that Rome was no longer invincible. Amid a pandemic on the scale of the Antonine plague, such people were defenseless.